The Boston Grand Hall glittered with chandeliers that looked like frozen fireworks. Laughter echoed between marble columns, and the sound of a string quartet floated through the air like silk. To the city's elite, this was the charity event of the year, an excuse to dress in gold, gossip, and pretend generosity came naturally. Among the waitstaff moving quietly through the sea of gowns and tuxedos was Amara Williams, a 25-year-old MBA student at Harvard. Her hair was tied neatly in a bun, her white shirt pressed to perfection. She carried herself with the calm precision of someone who had learned early in life that mistakes came with a price she couldn't afford. She needed this one-night job. Tuition was due next week, and her mother's medical bills weren't waiting. So when a woman in a red designer dress snapped her fingers and called out, "Waitress, over here!" Amara turned immediately, forcing a polite smile. The woman was Victoria Caldwell, the wife of real estate mogul Richard Caldwell. Everyone in Boston's upper circle knew her, her parties, her jewelry, her sharp tongue. Tonight, her lips curved in a cruel smirk as she eyed Amara from head to toe. "You should be more careful," Victoria said sweetly, just as Amara passed beside her. Then, in one deliberate move, she tipped her wine glass forward. Crimson liquid splashed across Amara's crisp white uniform, spreading like blood on snow. Gasps echoed. The orchestra faltered for a second. Amara froze, staring at the spreading stain. For a heartbeat, the world around her blurred. Then she blinked, straightened her shoulders, and said softly, "I am so sorry, ma'am. I'll clean this immediately." Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, don't worry, dear. I'm sure this sort of thing happens all the time when people like you try to navigate civilized events." The words hung heavy, venom wrapped in elegance. Guests glanced toward them, some embarrassed, others amused. No one stepped in. At the head table, Richard Caldwell lowered his champagne flute. He had seen the entire thing, the smirk, the spill, the humiliation. His gaze lingered on Amara's calm face, on the quiet strength behind her trembling hands. There was something about her composure that unsettled him, not pity, but respect. Amara knelt to pick up the shards of glass, her voice steady. "I'll take care of this right away." And as she walked toward the kitchen, the red stain still visible on her shirt, she could feel eyes following her. Some judging, some mocking, one observing with silent intensity. None of them knew that this moment, this single act of humiliation, would ignite a chain of events that would turn the entire room upside down. The kitchen doors swung open, and Amara stepped inside, her chest rising and falling as she finally allowed herself to breathe. The laughter from the ballroom still echoed faintly behind her, elegant, cruel, hollow. She stood in front of the sink, grabbed a towel, and began scrubbing the dark red stain from her shirt. No matter how much she tried, the wine had already soaked deep into the fabric, just like the words had soaked into her heart. For a brief second, she caught her reflection in the metal surface of the refrigerator. Her eyes were glossy but steady. She whispered to herself, "Not tonight, Amara. Not again. You've been through worse." She wasn't wrong. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, she had faced eviction notices, part-time jobs, and professors who assumed she didn't belong at Harvard. Compared to that, one arrogant woman's cruelty was nothing. Still, it stung. A fellow waiter, Marcus, glanced at her nervously. "You okay? That lady out there, she's something else." Amara forced a small smile. "I'm fine. I just need to finish the shift. Rent doesn't pay itself." 20 minutes later, she returned to the ballroom wearing a clean, spare uniform, her posture straight, her expression calm. The murmurs that rippled through the crowd followed her like shadows. Victoria Caldwell sat surrounded by her friends, laughing a little louder than necessary, her victory laugh. But what Victoria didn't expect was that the girl she tried to humiliate had returned with her head high, unshaken. Amara began refilling glasses with silent precision, her movements graceful, her eyes calm but observant. Every tray she carried, every polite "excuse me," carried quiet strength, the kind that couldn't be broken by insults or red wine. Across the room, Richard watched her again. Something about that quiet composure bothered him. It reminded him of the kind of dignity that no money could buy. He leaned toward his associate and murmured, "That young woman, what's her name?" "I think one of the temps said it's Amara Williams, sir. She's new." Richard nodded slowly. "Interesting." Meanwhile, Victoria's voice rose again, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Oh, look, she's back. I suppose even accidents can't ruin a paycheck."
Can they? Her friends giggled. Amara turned slightly, her gaze meeting Victoria's for just a moment. Not angry, not afraid, just steady, like someone who knew her worth too well to waste it on arguments. Then she smiled faintly and said, "Would you like me to refill your glass, ma'am?" The words were polite, but the tone, calm, measured, and fearless, made Victoria's smile falter for the first time. There was something unsettling about a person who refused to be broken. The music resumed. Conversations flowed again, but somewhere inside that glittering hall, an invisible tension was building, one that would soon turn a simple act of prejudice into the downfall of an entire empire. Victoria Caldwell leaned back in her chair, her diamond bracelet glittering under the warm chandelier light. Around her, a circle of wealthy socialites had formed like loyal courtiers around their queen. Each one laughed a little too hard, nodded a little too eagerly, desperate to stay in her favor. "Did you see her face?" Victoria began, her voice dripping with false innocence. "Poor thing looked like she'd never seen real crystal before. I swear, Richard needs to speak to the staff coordinator. Standards are slipping." The women giggled, clinking their champagne glasses. "Oh, Victoria," one of them chimed in, "you're terrible." Victoria smirked. "Someone has to keep order. Next thing you know, they'll be inviting waitresses to sit with us." The table erupted in shallow laughter, all except for Richard, who sat at the head of it, his jaw tightening as he listened. He didn't say a word, but inside, something was shifting. He'd spent years pretending not to see this side of his wife, the arrogance, the venom. But tonight, watching her cruelty unfold so publicly, he couldn't look away. Across the ballroom, Amara moved quietly from table to table, her steps steady despite the whispers that followed her. Every few seconds she could feel their eyes on her, the same women who wore kindness like perfume but reeked of superiority beneath it. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly to a guest, replacing his empty glass with a fresh one. Her tone was so composed that people who overheard couldn't decide if she was unaffected or simply stronger than anyone else in the room. As she passed Victoria's table again, she caught fragments of the conversation. "Imagine having to work at these events," said one woman, fanning herself dramatically. "I suppose some people enjoy being useful, though I can't imagine what kind of education leads someone to that." The words struck like tiny darts, but Amara kept walking. Inside, however, she was memorizing everything. The tone, the phrasing, even who laughed the loudest. She had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than any reply. In the kitchen, Marcus met her at the door. "They're still talking about you, huh?" "Let them," she said quietly. "People show you who they are when they think you're beneath them." Meanwhile, Richard sat watching the reflection of his wife's face in the golden rim of his glass. Her laughter sounded different now, shrill, forced, hollow. For the first time, he didn't feel pride sitting beside her. He felt disgust. He looked back toward the far end of the hall, where Amara's figure moved gracefully among the guests. Whoever she is, she doesn't belong in the background. What no one in that glittering ballroom realized was that the night wasn't over, and before it ended, every false smile and whispered insult would come crashing down in front of them all. The night was reaching its peak. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the faint hum of the orchestra filled the hall like a well-rehearsed performance of wealth. But beneath that glitter, something darker was simmering. Victoria Caldwell wasn't satisfied. The small embarrassment she had caused Amara wasn't enough. She wanted to crush her, to make sure everyone knew the difference between their kind and hers. She caught sight of Amara again, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Her lips curled. "Oh, look who's back," she said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "I was worried she'd melt from shame." Her friends turned their eyes toward Amara, hungry for entertainment. Victoria raised her hand and waved her over. "Waitress, come here a moment, dear." Amara approached calmly, her back straight, eyes steady. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria held out the printed event menu, covered in elaborate French terms that even some of the guests couldn't pronounce. "We were just discussing tonight's meal," she said, voice dripping with fake politeness. "Would you be a darling and read this out loud for us? I'm not sure everyone here knows what they're eating." The table erupted in soft chuckles. It was clear what she wanted, another public humiliation. Amara's hand trembled slightly as she took the paper, but her voice remained calm.
The nights translating research papers, and the 2 years she spent on exchange in Lyon, France, the same years that had changed her life. She lifted her gaze, locked eyes with Victoria, and said softly, "With pleasure, ma'am." Then, in a clear, elegant tone, she began to read. Amuse-bouche de foie gras au champagne, suivi par les potages parmentier aux truffes noires de Périgord. The words rolled off her tongue effortlessly, each syllable pronounced with perfect French accent and rhythm. Conversations around the table stopped. Heads turned. Even the orchestra seemed to quiet for a moment. By the time Amara reached the last line, Victoria's smirk had vanished. Her complexion had gone pale, her laughter gone dry. Amara lowered the menu gracefully, her smile polite and composed. "I hope that was clear enough for everyone, ma'am." For a moment, silence ruled the room. Then, a few guests began to applaud, hesitant at first, then stronger. One of the older men at a nearby table nodded approvingly. Richard Caldwell's eyes gleamed with quiet admiration. He rose slowly, adjusting his tie, and said in a firm tone that carried through the hall, "Thank you, miss. That was impeccable." Amara bowed her head slightly and walked away, her expression serene. Behind her, Victoria sat frozen, gripping her champagne glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. The laughter that once surrounded her had disappeared. In its place was a heavy silence, the kind that follows a mask cracking in public. For the first time that evening, Victoria Caldwell felt something she hadn't in years: humiliation. The rest of the evening moved like a slow, unraveling thread. Conversations that once flowed easily now carried tension, polite smiles hiding unease. The only sound Victoria could clearly hear was the echo of Amara's voice, elegant and precise, repeating in her mind like a melody she wished she could erase. She forced herself to laugh to pretend she wasn't shaken, but every time someone glanced her way, she felt it, that subtle pity, that silent judgment. Her friends avoided eye contact. The same women who used to cling to her words now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, afraid to be seen choosing the wrong side. At the head table, Richard Caldwell sat in thoughtful silence. He wasn't a man easily impressed. Decades in business had taught him to see beyond facades. But the calm confidence Amara had shown struck something deep. The way she faced humiliation with grace, the way she commanded a room without raising her voice. It reminded him of a kind of strength he'd nearly forgotten existed. After the final toast, as guests began leaving the main hall, Richard slipped away from the service corridor. He found Amara near the service corridor, collecting empty glasses. "Miss Williams, is it?" he asked softly. Amara straightened, startled that the host himself had approached her. "Yes, sir," she said respectfully. He studied her for a moment. "You handled yourself with remarkable composure tonight. I owe you an apology for what happened. My wife's behavior was unacceptable." Her lips parted slightly. She hadn't expected that. "You don't have to apologize for her, sir,"
"I do," he said firmly, "because I let it happen, and because people like her only act that way when others choose to stay silent." Amara hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I just tried to do my job." Richard smiled faintly. "You did much more than that." There was a pause, long enough for unspoken curiosity to fill the air. "You're not just a waitress, are you?" he asked, voice gentle but probing. Her eyes flickered, caught between honesty and caution. "No, sir. I'm an MBA student at Harvard. I work here part-time to cover tuition." Richard blinked, astonished. "Harvard," he repeated quietly. Then he laughed. Not mockingly, but in disbelief. "My God! Victoria had no idea." "Most people don't," Amara said simply. "They don't look long enough to see past the uniform." Her words landed heavy. Richard nodded slowly, his respect deepening by the second. "You've just taught me more about leadership than half the people I've hired." For a brief moment, their eyes met, not as boss and worker, but as two people who understood the weight of silence and the cost of dignity. Then she turned back to her work, polite as ever. As he walked away, Richard glanced over his shoulder one last time. The image of Amara standing beneath the golden light, surrounded by empty glasses, yet holding her head high, stayed burned in his mind. He didn't know it yet, but this small conversation had already planted the seed for a decision that would soon shake his entire world and destroy the one his wife had so carefully built. The following morning, Boston's skyline glimmered under a pale winter sun. Amara awoke in her small apartment near Harvard Square, with the events of the night still replaying in her head. Next shift, but every time she looked at the red mark, it reminded her of that moment, the humiliation, the silence, and then the voice of Richard Caldwell saying, "You've just taught me more about leadership than half of the people I've hired." She tried to push it aside. There were bills to pay, classes to attend, and deadlines waiting. She didn't have time to dwell on the cruelty of one woman, no matter how rich she was. That afternoon, as she sat in the university library finalizing her thesis outline on systemic discrimination in corporate environments, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" "Miss Williams." The voice was deep, composed. "This is Richard Caldwell." Her pen froze mid-sentence. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell. Good afternoon, sir. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'd like to meet with you. I believe last night was eye-opening, for me at least. Would you have time to talk today?" Amara blinked, stunned. "Talk? About what, sir?" "About an opportunity," he said simply. "I'll send a car to your campus. If you're free, meet me at the Caldwell Development Headquarters in an hour." An hour later, she stepped out of a sleek black sedan in front of a glass tower overlooking the Charles River. The building screamed wealth and power, everything she'd grown used to observing from the outside. A receptionist guided her upstairs, where Richard waited in an office framed by panoramic views of the city. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing toward a leather chair. He looked tired but focused, as if he'd spent the entire night thinking. "Amara," he began, dropping the formalities, "I won't waste your time. What I witnessed last night, my wife's behavior, your grace, it forced me to look at my company differently. We talk about diversity and equality, but I've realized we barely understand them." Amara stayed quiet, listening. "I need someone who does understand," he continued. "Someone who's seen both sides, the privilege and the prejudice. You're studying systemic discrimination, aren't you?" Her eyes widened. "Yes. My thesis explores how bias shapes corporate hiring and leadership structures." "Then this might interest you." He slid a document across the table, a consulting proposal. "I want you to lead an independent review of Caldwell Development's internal practices. Full transparency. You'd have total autonomy, and you'd be compensated at market rate for senior consultants." Amara stared at the paper, speechless. "Mr. Caldwell, This is far beyond anything I... He raised a hand gently. You've earned this, not as charity, but as recognition of your competence. My company needs people like you, people who see what others ignore. She took a slow breath. Why me? He smiled faintly. Because you didn't shout back when you had every right to. Because you chose dignity over revenge. And because that kind of strength can rebuild a culture. Amara's chest tightened. She glanced down at the document again, the weight of possibility sinking in. Outside the window, the city glowed in shades of gold, a reminder that some stories, even the painful ones, could be rewritten. Victoria Caldwell woke up late that morning, her head pounding from champagne and ego. The sunlight streaming through her penthouse windows felt harsh, intrusive, a cruel reminder that the world hadn't stopped revolving around her. She stretched, yawned, and reached for her phone. What she didn't expect were the notifications. Dozens of them. Messages, missed calls, whispers already circulating through Boston's upper circles. Heard about last night. What happened? Is it true your husband talked to the waitress? Victoria, darling, everything all right? Talk to the waitress. That phrase clung to her like smoke. She rushed downstairs, silk robe fluttering behind her, and found Richard sitting at the breakfast table reading the newspaper. Calm. Too calm. Richard, she started sharply, I've been getting messages all morning. What exactly did you tell people about that girl? He didn't look up. Nothing, he said evenly. They must have seen me speaking to her. Speaking to her? She snapped. You made me look like a fool in front of everyone last night, and now you're speaking to her? Richard finally folded the paper and met her gaze. Cold, steady, unflinching. Victoria, you made yourself look like a fool. I just happened to be watching. Excuse me? He stood, buttoning his jacket. Do you know who that girl is? She's a Harvard MBA student, intelligent, disciplined, and probably more qualified than half the executives in this city. And while you were busy humiliating her, she was teaching everyone in that room what true grace looks like. Victoria's voice trembled, though she tried to keep her tone sharp. She's a waitress, Richard. Don't romanticize this. She was paid to serve. And you were born to lead. Yet you've done nothing
but belittle people to feel taller. The words hit her harder than she expected. She watched as her husband grabbed his keys. Where are you going? She demanded. To my office, he said. And for the record, I've invited Amara Williams there today. We're discussing a consulting position. Victoria's eyes widened. You're joking. He paused at the door. No, Victoria. For once in my life, I'm doing something serious. The door closed. The echo lingered. She stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The idea that Richard, her husband, her status, her trophy, had not only defended that girl, but hired her, made her skin crawl. Her mind raced. How would this look to her friends? What would the city say? Grabbing her phone, she called her closest ally, Evelyn. He's lost his mind, Victoria hissed. He's bringing that waitress into the company. Evelyn's voice hesitated. Darling, maybe just let it go. People saw how you treated her. You might want to keep a low profile for a while. Victoria's hand shook with rage. Keep a low profile? I'm Victoria Caldwell. But for the first time, the words didn't sound powerful. They sounded desperate. As she stood by the window, watching Richard's car disappear down the street, a new feeling crept into her chest. Not anger, not pride. Fear. She just didn't know yet how far her fall was about to go. The next morning, Amara stood in front of a mirror in her small apartment, straightening the collar of her navy blue blazer. It wasn't designer, but it was sharp, a symbol of how far she'd come and how much further she was about to go. Her reflection looked calm, but her heart was racing.
Today was her first official day at Caldwell Development, not as a waitress, but as a corporate diversity consultant. When she arrived at the glass tower downtown, the receptionist greeted her with a polite smile and a touch of curiosity. "Good morning, Miss Williams. Mr. Caldwell is expecting you." She followed the woman into the elevator, her palms slick with nervous excitement. As the doors opened on the top floor, she was met by a sweeping view of Boston, the Charles River shimmering in the distance. Richard was waiting by the window, his expression proud but professional. "Welcome, Amara. I meant what I told you. You'll have complete freedom to do what's necessary. I want a full audit. Hiring, promotions, leadership behavior, everything. I want the truth, even if it hurts." She nodded. "Then we'll start today." By noon, Amara had already begun interviewing department heads, reviewing company data, and observing daily operations. Some employees eyed her skeptically, others whispered in corners, unsure of who she was or how she'd suddenly appeared. But it didn't take long for word to spread. The new consultant is the same woman who was humiliated at the gala. And that changed everything. By the end of the week, people were treating her with a mix of respect and awe. She didn't flaunt her new position, didn't mention the scandal. She simply did her job with quiet authority. Every report she wrote was clear, every meeting precise. Her intelligence spoke louder than any revenge could. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Caldwell sat in her favorite cafe, or at least what used to be her favorite cafe. The whispers followed her like shadows. When she entered, conversations paused. When she passed, eyes turned. The same women who once adored her now looked away, afraid to be associated with her. At one table, she overheard two socialites murmuring, "Did you hear Richard hired the waitress? She's some kind of Harvard genius?" "I know, and they say the company is already changing its policies. She's becoming quite influential." Victoria clenched her jaw and stormed out. The humiliation burned hotter than ever. That evening, she confronted Richard at home. "Do you realize what people are saying? That you've replaced me with her? In every sense of the word?" He didn't even look up from his laptop. "People are saying a lot of things, Victoria. But for once, they're right about something." Her breath caught. "You're actually defending her." "I'm not defending her," he interrupted quietly. "I'm admiring her. The woman you tried to destroy is now helping me rebuild everything you corrupted, starting with this company." Victoria's voice cracked. "You can't just erase me, Richard." He finally met his eyes. "No," he said coldly. "You erased yourself." He stood, leaving her speechless in the middle of the room. Amara's quiet victory was already unfolding, but she didn't know yet that her rise would soon go far beyond corporate walls, and that Victoria's world was about to collapse in a way no one could stop. 3 weeks later, the storm finally broke. It started early one morning when Boston's most prominent news outlets all carried the same headline. "Audio leak exposes racism among city's elite. Caldwell Charity Gala scandal rocks high society."
Spread like wildfire. Radio stations played the 23-minute audio clip in full. Victoria's voice crystal clear, dripping with contempt as she mocked Amara in front of dozens of witnesses. Every cruel word, every laugh, every moment of silence from those who didn't intervene. By noon, it was everywhere, trending on social media, discussed in classrooms, debated on television. Hashtags filled the internet. Hashtag justice for Amara. Hashtag the waitress who spoke French. In her penthouse, Victoria stared at her phone in disbelief. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through thousands of messages. Journalists requesting interviews, old friends distancing themselves, online strangers calling her every name imaginable. Her phone rang nonstop. One call was from her lawyer. "Victoria, the foundation has released a statement. You've been removed from your position effective immediately. They can't be associated with you after this." What? She gasped. They can't just... They can, he interrupted softly, and they already have. She hung up, only for another call to come in. Her interior designer, then her personal trainer, then her stylist. One by one, each conversation ended the same way. Apologies, excuses, cancellations. By evening, Richard came home to find her sitting at the kitchen counter, eyes red and glassy. "Richard," she said, voice shaking, "you have to do something. That recording, she's destroying me." He placed his briefcase down and looked at her, his face unreadable. "No, Victoria, you destroyed yourself. She just pressed record." "But this is revenge," she shouted. "She planned it all." Richard exhaled slowly. "No, what you called humiliation, she turned into proof of who you really are." He turned to leave, but she grabbed his arm. "You can't just walk away after everything we've built." He looked at her hand, then into her eyes. "What you built was a reputation on cruelty and control. What I'm building now is something that might actually matter." Her grip loosened. He gently pulled away. The next day, Amara arrived at Caldwell Development's office to find reporters gathered outside. Microphones and cameras turned toward her as she stepped out of the elevator, elegant and composed in a beige suit. "Miss Williams, how does it feel to see justice served?" one journalist called out. She paused, smiled faintly, and replied, "Justice isn't revenge. It's truth finally being heard." Inside the company, employees applauded as she entered the boardroom. Richard stood at the front, his voice firm but proud. "Starting today, Amara Williams will lead our permanent diversity and ethics division. Her work has already been transforming this company, and her courage has reminded us what real integrity looks like." The room filled with applause. Amara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of months of struggle lifting from her shoulders. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Caldwell sat alone in her silent penthouse, curtains drawn, phone buzzing endlessly with messages she refused to read. Each notification was another reminder that her empire of status had collapsed, and for the first time in her life, she was invisible. But for Amara, this was only the beginning. A new chapter where her voice would no longer be silenced and her story would echo far beyond that ballroom. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable night. The night humiliation turned into power. Boston had changed. Caldwell Development had changed. And so had Amara Williams. She now walked through the company's halls not as a worker in uniform, but as Director of Diversity and Ethics, leading a department she'd built from the ground up. Her presence commanded quiet respect. People who once whispered behind her back now paused to listen when she spoke. Under her guidance, the company implemented new training programs, mentorships for underrepresented students, and transparent hiring systems. The results were undeniable. Productivity rose, turnover dropped, and Caldwell Development became a case study in how humility can transform leadership. But Amara never let success blind her. On her desk, she kept the same small notebook she used in college, filled with quotes, ideas, and one short sentence she'd written after that gala night. "Strength doesn't shout. It observes, endures, and acts when it must." Meanwhile, Victoria Caldwell's world had turned to dust. Her name was now synonymous with disgrace. Clubs revoked her membership, charities refused her donations, and her friends, the ones who used to toast her, had vanished. Even her social media was a battlefield of criticism and ridicule. Her mansion felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. The silence was suffocating. She spent her days scrolling through old photos, trying to understand how one evening had unraveled decades of privilege. It wasn't until she heard Amara's voice on television one afternoon that the full weight of it hit her. Amara stood at
Podium during a Harvard business conference, addressing hundreds of students and executives. Cameras flashed, capturing her calm confidence. "Don't let anyone define your worth," Amara said, her voice steady. "Prejudice may try to silence you, but dignity speaks louder. The best revenge is success they never believed you could achieve." The audience erupted in applause. Victoria turned off the TV and sat in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time, she saw herself not as the victim of a scandal, but as its author. A few weeks later, Richard Caldwell visited Amara's office. He looked different, lighter, freer. "I wanted to thank you," he said sincerely, "not just for what you've done for this company, but for showing me that integrity doesn't need wealth to be powerful." Amara smiled gently. "You gave me a chance, Mr. Caldwell. That's something most people wouldn't have done." He shook his head. "No, Amara, you gave me a second chance to be the kind of man I should have been years ago." As he left, Amara gazed out the window at the Boston skyline glowing in the afternoon light. The same city that once looked down on her now carried her story as a lesson, a symbol of resilience. And somewhere in that quiet penthouse across town, Victoria Caldwell finally learned the hardest truth of all. The titles fade, money evaporates, and reputation crumbles, but character endures. Because in the end, it wasn't the millionaire's wife who left a mark on history, it was the young waitress who refused to bow her head. And her legacy would outshine every chandelier in that ballroom for generations to come.